Okay, so here's the defense of that second premise. I'm going to lay it out in 4 steps, or 3 steps. First step, a reminder of what ambiguity is. We talked about this in class. Ambiguity is a general phenomenon. Second, Ayer's claim is that the ability to do otherwise, that phrase, is ambiguous. And so the whole condition, the AO condition itself, is ambiguous because it contains that phrase. And we'll spell out what the 2 interpretations he thinks of the ability to do otherwise are. And then third, his claim is that determinism is compatible with at least one of those 2 interpretations. If he can get you to that conclusion, then he's gotten you to the conclusion that determinism is compatible with the ability to do otherwise. Okay, so ambiguity, as we talked about in class, is a linguistic phenomenon. A sentence, term or phrase is ambiguous whenever it admits of multiple equally admissible meanings. And so in this little cartoon, don't trust atoms, they make up everything. Make up could have 2 different meanings. And the humor is a result of the fact that both meanings are admissible in the context. So make up could mean lie, or it could mean physically compose. And those are 2 totally different things. But we can't tell just by looking at the surrounding context which one the thing means. So ambiguity is pretty commonplace. And one of the things that analytic philosophers, especially early analytic philosophers, were kind of obsessed with is thinking that a lot of philosophical problems arise as a result of our failure to recognize that our words are ambiguous, and that once we make our words more precise and we lay out each of the possible admissible meanings, what we'll see is that what we originally thought was a problem dissolves. And it was just kind of a linguistic confusion the whole time. That's basically what Ayer is going to say. So here's the next step, that the phrase the ability to do otherwise is ambiguous, has more than one admissible meaning. So here's the first thing that someone could mean when they say, I did something A, but I could have done otherwise than A. One thing they could mean is what we can call the indeterministic interpretation. They could mean that their doing A was not determined or caused by anything in the past, by anything in the laws of nature. And as a result, given the very same past and the very same laws of nature, they either could have done A or they could have done something else. In other words, doing A and not doing A are both consistent with or not fixed by anything in the past or the laws of nature. So this indeterministic interpretation gives rise to a kind of branching future picture of what happens when people have the ability to do otherwise. On this reading, we don't have that ability unless, consistent with the very same past and the very same laws of nature, there are multiple possible futures before us. One in which you go to Wake Forest, one in which you don't go to Wake Forest, consistent with the same past and the same laws. So that if you rerun the story of the actual world up until the moment that you make the choice, nothing is different. Nothing in your past, nothing in the past of your parents, nothing in the culture, none of it is different until the very moment that you get to making the decision. And sometimes when you play the tape, you go to Wake. And other times when you play the tape, you go to Duke. And then other times you take a gap year. This is the sense of a radically open future. And it's indeterministic because, as you can see on the diagram, nothing behind the woman standing there making the choice, nothing in the past, the state of the world in the past, and nothing in the laws of nature determines which of those three paths she's going to go down. It's basically just random. That's not the only thing we could mean when we say that I have the ability to do otherwise than A for some action A. Another thing we could mean is not that I have the ability to do something other than A given the very same past, but rather what we could mean is that if the past had been a little different, I wouldn't have done A. Specifically, what we might mean is if I had wanted not to do A, or decided not to do A, then I wouldn't have done it. Sure enough, in the actual world, I did choose, I did decide, I did want to do A. And given that, I did A. Had I not decided to do A, though, or had I decided to do something else, I wouldn't have done it. Maybe that's all we mean by the ability to do otherwise. So we can represent that here. So there's no branching futures here in the actual world. The actual world has the same past and the same laws of nature as in the previous diagram. And then we have at T2 the decision to do A, and then the future is there's just one in which that individual does A. But there could be some other possible world in which you'll notice that the state of the past there isn't S1 anymore, it's now S2, and it's yellow just to make that stark. So the past is a little different, and that leads to some differences in the future, which result in her deciding not to do A as opposed to doing A. And that issues then in her not doing A. And so that counterfactual, if X had wanted to not do A, then X would not have done A, is true. Maybe that's all we mean. Those are the two interpretations. And Ayer's claim is these are equally admissible interpretations. Neither is like obviously a better, more faithful reading of this expression, the ability to do otherwise, than the other. And for this reason, we only need to reconcile determinism, he thinks, with one of those two interpretations. I mean, if the counterfactual interpretation was just like implausible on its face, if it was just like, oh, that's obviously not what we mean when we say the ability to do otherwise, then Ayer's project would be sunk, because the indeterministic interpretation is obviously not consistent with determinism. So the final step is for him to show that determinism is compatible with the counterfactual interpretation. So the first step to seeing why he thinks this is to notice that counterfactual conditionals outside of the domain of human action can certainly be true, even if determinism is true. To suppose otherwise is to confuse fatalism and determinism. So let's talk about a counterfactual that doesn't involve your decisions or anything about human agency. I do actually have a glass this time. This glass. I'm not going to drop it. If I had dropped it, though, it would have shattered. Can the determinist make sense of that claim? It seems true to me. I'm not going to take a stand on whether determinism is true, but if you are a determinist and you think that the placement of this glass and the way in which I held it and so on were all determined by the state of the world long before I was born and the laws of nature, if I believed all those things, could I still say that if I had dropped the glass, it would have shattered? Well, yeah, because suppose I thought, as many determinists do, that the state of the world at the first moment could possibly have been a little different, or that the laws of nature could possibly have been a little different. Had that occurred, it didn't, but had it, the very next moment would have been a little different. And so would the very next moment, and the next moment, and the next, and the next, and the next, until we get up to the moment where here I am holding this thing up. And maybe in this alternative, I am determined to be a little more reckless and really lift the thing up, and it's also determined to be a little more slippery than it actually is. This all traces back to earlier differences. Had those things happened, that glass would have shattered. It would have slipped out of my hand, hit the floor, and shattered. That's not how things actually went, but had the past been different, the present would have been different, and so would the future. And so that counterfactual is still true, even if determinism is true. Actual past deterministically gives rise to the actual present, which determines the actual future. But the determinist can and should say, had you plugged in a different past into your function, you would have gotten a different present, and so you would have gotten a different future. Indeed, that's required by determinism. Determinism doesn't say that there's only one possible past. Fatalism, on the other hand, says determinism is true and there's only one possible first moment and only one possible set of laws of nature. And as a result, there are no alternative possibilities in which I drop the glass. The way the world actually is the way the world had to be. And so counterfactual conditionals, because their antecedents run contrary to actuality, are false. All of them. It's false that if the Nazis had won World War II, we would all be speaking German. That seems true, but according to fatalism, not only is it true that that the Nazis were determined and by necessity, given the same past, going to lose World War II, but there are no other possibilities in which differences in the early history of the world lead to a Nazi victory down the road. Fatalism says the way things actually went, that's the only way things could have gone. So we now can leverage that point that other kinds of counterfactual conditionals given fatalism are false, but not given mere determinism. We can leverage that point into a larger argument focused on the counterfactual interpretation of AO, specifically counterfactual conditionals involving human action. So if determinism is true, do I ever have the ability to do otherwise? Well, what do we mean? Let's be specific. Let's ask, do I ever have the ability to do otherwise as understood by the counterfactual interpretation of that phrase? Specifically, is it ever true when I do some action A? Could it ever be true, if determinism is true, that if I had decided not to do A, then I wouldn't have done it? Sure, just as it can be true that if I had dropped the glass it would have broken, it can also be true that if I had decided, which I'm not going to throw the glass across the room, that would have determined the glass to be flung across the room. Had the ordinary thief decided not to steal, the ordinary thief would have been determined, his action of not stealing would have then deterministically resulted. So what this shows is that even if determinism is true, all three of those conditions that Ayer gives for freedom can be met. Ordinary thief decides to steal, that causes deterministically him to steal. Indeed, that first decision itself is a deterministic result of earlier processes. But what matters is that he has the ability to do otherwise, which he does, because it's true that if he had decided not to steal, then he wouldn't have stolen. That's the AO condition, or one reading of it. So here's, given determinism, the actual world and the possible world differ in the past, and those differences lead to differences in the decision about whether to steal. And the differences in the decision about whether to steal deterministically lead to different behaviors. The upshot is that the ordinary thief has the ability to do otherwise, even if determinism is true. But the ability to do otherwise was the main reason we were worried about determinism and freedom. And so we've just reconciled determinism and freedom. Just want to note that Ayer isn't claiming that we always possess the ability to do otherwise if determinism is true. I mean, some counterfactuals are going to be false given determinism. If I had dropped the glass, it would have turned into a bird and flown away. That's going to be false if determinism is true. Likewise, if the kleptomaniac had decided not to steal, he wouldn't have stolen. That's false given determinism, because the kleptomaniac has a compulsion. He would have stolen anyway. So we've just defended the second premise: determinism is compatible with the ability to do otherwise. And it follows that determinism is compatible with free will. So that's Ayer's argument. I leave you with this bizarre meme that I made a couple years ago, and yeah, I don't know why I do this. All right, take care.